She was born in a small village where the river curved like a silver thread through the land, feeding the crops, quenching the thirst of animals, and singing its eternal lullaby at night. From her earliest days, the girl was drawn to its waters. While other children played in the dust of the fields or climbed the trees, she could often be found at the riverbank, her feet in the cool current, her eyes following the ripples as though the river whispered secrets meant for her alone. The villagers began to call her the River Child, not as an insult, but as a recognition of how the water seemed to mirror her spirit. She was gentle, soft-spoken, and kind. Her smile could ease tempers, and her laughter, which often mingled with the sound of flowing water, carried a calm that made people pause to listen. She had no riches to her name, no powerful relatives to protect her, and no outward strength that would intimidate anyone. Yet, she carried something deeper, an innocence that seemed to shine even in hardship. If an elder needed help gathering firewood, she went. If a child fell and scraped their knee, she was the one to clean the wound, even giving up her small cloth to wrap it. Her presence was a quiet balm in the village. Many admired her, but admiration soon twisted into something darker. It was the women who first began to whisper. They saw how the men looked at her, not because she flaunted herself, but because her serenity drew attention without effort. Her skin glowed in the sun like river-polished stone, her movements graceful like the reeds swaying in the breeze. She did not dress grandly, but the simplest cloth on her seemed to suit her perfectly. Some of the men compared her to a spirit sent by the river itself, and this made jealousy sharpen in the hearts of other women. They mocked her simplicity, scoffed at her closeness to the river, and accused her of seeking attention she never once demanded. The young men too resented her in different ways. To some, she was a reminder of purity they could never possess. To others, her kindness was mistaken for pride, as if she placed herself above them by refusing to join in their cruelty or idle gossip. They saw her detachment from malice as judgment, though she never judged anyone. Her quiet refusal to laugh when others mocked someone else, her silence when rumors spread, made her stand apart. And those who are different are rarely safe in the hands of a restless community. Her stepfamily, particularly her stepmother, despised her the most. The girl had lost her own mother when she was still young, and her father remarried. The stepmother resented how the villagers, even in their gossip, still admired the girl for her gentleness. She resented how the girl's hands, though worn with chores, never seemed to grow rough. She resented how her presence seemed to bring a hush over arguments, as if even anger respected her. Where envy brewed, cruelty soon followed. But the girl herself noticed little of this gathering resentment. Her heart was not blind, but she always chose to believe the best in people. When she caught harsh eyes upon her, she lowered her head and greeted with a smile. When someone spoke to her with bitterness, she responded with gentleness. She could not understand why anyone would hate her, for she carried no harm toward them. Her days passed in a rhythm of small kindnesses, her evenings by the river, singing softly to herself. The river seemed to answer her songs. When her voice rose, the water rippled as if stirred by unseen hands. When she bent to touch its surface, fish swam closer instead of darting away. Children sometimes followed her to watch, marveling at how the world seemed gentler around her. But adults muttered that such closeness with nature was not natural, that perhaps the river had claimed her in some way. Their fear disguised itself as disdain, and the envy that brewed in their hearts became easier to justify. Still, the girl held to her innocence. She loved her beads, small trinkets she had woven herself, but she loved giving them away even more. When a child admired one, she would untie it from her wrist and gift it with a smile. She never hoarded food or cloth, sharing whatever she had. She asked for little in return, only the peace of sitting by the river, watching the sunlight scatter across the waves. What she did not see was how her purity became a mirror to others' ugliness. Each act of kindness they received reminded them of how little kindness they themselves showed. Each time she forgave, it highlighted their grudges. Her very presence unsettled them, though she never intended it. By simply being herself, she provoked the shadows that others carried in their hearts. And so, the whispers grew louder, the envy thicker, until the villagers no longer saw her as a gentle girl with a heart tied to the river. They began to see her as a problem, a presence too pure for their comfort, a spirit among them who made their own faults impossible to ignore. The river child, though innocent, unknowingly walked a path that would stir the darkest parts of the human heart, leading her toward betrayal she never expected. It began with small murmurs, carried between cooking fires and whispered during long evenings when the fields had yielded little. Misfortunes, whether a poor harvest, a child's fever, or a broken marriage, were natural to life in the village, Yet more and more often her name surfaced alongside them. "The river child is cursed," some muttered, their voices low but sharp. "The river favors her, and so it withholds from us." At first these were only words of envy, spoken without belief. But envy has a way of feeding on itself, growing bold until it becomes truth in the mouths of those who speak it. The women, already restless from watching their husbands glance too long in her direction, fanned the flames of resentment. They mocked her beauty, sneered at her quiet grace, and twisted her kindness into arrogance. "She thinks she is above us," they would say, too pure to laugh, too proud to gossip. What had once been grudging admiration now hardened into dislike. Kin too turned against her. Her stepmother, ever eager to see her diminished, planted seeds of suspicion among neighbors. When goats wandered too close to the river and drowned, she hinted that the girls' songs had lured them to their deaths. When a child fell sick with fever, she shook her head and asked if it was not strange how the sickness came after the child had played near the girl. "She carries something unnatural," the stepmother whispered, "something the river gave her, and the river is a jealous god." Some men, who once admired her beauty in silence, began to resent the hold she seemed to have on their thoughts. It embarrassed them to feel drawn to a girl who asked for nothing, who gave her kindness freely without flirtation. They twisted their attraction into anger, muttering that she bewitched them, that her songs carried a spell meant to ensnare. The envy of the women and the unease of the men wove together into a net of bitterness. As the seasons passed, every misfortune seemed to trace back to her in their minds. When rains came late, they said the river withheld its blessing because of her. When food spoiled too quickly, they said her touch had cursed it. A young man who tripped while carrying firewood claimed it was her gaze that made him stumble. Each incident, no matter how ordinary, became proof of her supposed burden on the village. What wounded most was that even those she had helped began to turn away. A mother whose child she had comforted during illness no longer allowed the girl near her home. A neighbor who once shared food with her now crossed the path to avoid her. The very people who had felt the warmth of her kindness now muttered that she was too good to be true. To them, she was not merely a girl. They convinced themselves she was a vessel of misfortune, and that if they did not turn against her, the river itself might turn against them. Bitterness has a hunger, and once it tastes blood it does not stop. The villagers began to despise not only her beauty and grace but her very existence. Her innocence, once admired, became unbearable to them. They did not see her as a person anymore, but as a mirror reflecting their own insecurities and failings. Each scar of jealousy in their hearts deepened into a wound, and together, their wounded envy grew into hatred. It began in whispers in the corners of huts where the fire burned low and shadows clung to the walls. Envy had done its work, carving out reason from their hearts and replacing it with fear and spite. The river child had become, in their minds, too dangerous to be left alive. They spoke of her beauty as a curse, of her songs as spells that bent the will of men, of her kindness as a disguise for something darker. "She is not like us," one elder hissed, his voice trembling with anger and unease. "If the river gave her life, then the river must take it back." At first, the talk was hesitant, guilt hanging heavy on their tongues. But the more they repeated the words, the easier they became to believe. Her stepmother, who had planted the first seeds of suspicion, watered them now with venom. "As long as she walks among us, the river will not rest. Do you not see how it punishes us? The storms, the sickness, the hunger? She is the reason." A murmur of agreement followed, for people are eager to place blame when they cannot face the weight of chance or misfortune. The plan took shape slowly, then all at once. They decided that she must be given back to the river, her grave chosen by the very waters she loved. The river that had carried her laughter and songs would now carry her silence. They convinced themselves this was justice, even mercy, that the river demanded her life, and by offering it they would save their own. The choice of the river was not arbitrary, it was cruel and deliberate. It was the place she had found peace, the place that had always embraced her when people did not. To cast her into it was to twist her sanctuary into her tomb. They plotted in secrecy, though in truth the entire village knew. No one raised a voice against it. Some were bound by fear, some by envy, and some by the desperate hope that this sacrifice would end their misfortunes. They told themselves lies to still the pangs of conscience. "She is not one of us," they whispered. "She belongs to the river." Others claimed they were sparing her a worse fate, that if left unchecked, her powers would destroy them all. Beneath their words, however, was the raw and ugly truth. They could not bear her light, so they sought to extinguish it. The night before their act, they gathered near the riverbank, their faces half lit by torches. They spoke in low tones, deciding how it would be done. Some argued she should be tied, lest the current return her to the shore. Others insisted she must be weighted with stones, her body kept from ever rising. One man suggested cutting her throat first, but the stepmother objected. No blood should stain the land, the river alone must take her. In the end they agreed. At dawn, when the first light touched the water, she would be led there under the pretense of a ritual. Bound and powerless, she would be thrown into the depths. Even as they planned, unease lingered among them. The river's current seemed louder than usual, its voice rushing against the banks as if listening. Some swore the water reflected not their faces but hers, pale and solemn, watching them with eyes that accused even before the deed was done. Yet none dared to stop. They convinced themselves the river would be satisfied, that once she was gone they could eat, drink, and laugh without shadows pressing in on their joy. And so, with their hearts hardened, they sealed her fate. By the river she had loved, they would betray her. By the water she had sung to, they would silence her forever. They came for her at dusk, when the last sliver of sun sank behind the line of trees and shadows began to lengthen over the village. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and damp soil, a silence too heavy for an evening that should have been filled with children's laughter and the crackle of hearth fires. She sensed it before they reached her, the tightening of gazes, the hush that spread like a sickness, the way even the dogs slunk low and whimpered. Still, she stayed seated by the river's edge, her bare feet touching the cool water as if it might offer her protection. The men moved first, emboldened by their whispered anger, followed closely by women whose hearts had long hardened with envy. Their faces were carved with something darker than resolve, it was hatred laced with fear. They believed her to be too perfect, too blessed, too loved by the river that gave life to the land. And envy, when left untended, always seeks a grave to fill. They called her name, not with affection but with venom, demanding she rise. When she stood, her dress of soft woven cloth clung to her, glowing faintly in the dying light as though even the sunset could not abandon her. Some in the crowd hesitated at that moment, struck by her innocence, but others pressed forward, unwilling to let doubt undo their plan. She asked what wrong she had done, her voice trembling yet steady, carrying the question that had burned silently in her chest for weeks. But none answered. They did not come for truth, they came for silence. Two men seized her arms, rough hands gripping tight enough to bruise. She struggled, but the more she resisted, the more their grip hardened. She cried out for help, to her kin, to the elders, to the river itself, but the villagers only looked on. Their eyes avoided hers, fixed instead on the ground, on the sky, anywhere but her face. Some clenched their fists, others wept quietly, yet no one stepped forward. Betrayal is loudest in silence. They dragged her through the village paths, her bare feet stumbling over stones, her voice breaking as she begged them to stop. Children peered from behind doorways, their small eyes wide with confusion and fear, too young to understand why a gentle girl should be led like a criminal. Her cries echoed off the huts, carried into the trees, but none answered. The decision had been made, and in their cruelty, they believed themselves justified. When they reached the riverbank, the water was no longer calm. It rippled and foamed as if sensing what was to come, its current whispering warnings no one dared to hear. The girl's tears mingled with the river's spray as she pleaded, reminding them of her kindness, of how she had shared food with the hungry and songs with the lonely. She reminded them of the time she fetched water for the weary and tended to the sick. But memory, twisted by envy, becomes fragile, and none cared to recall her goodness. They saw only the reflection of their bitterness. Into the river she must go, one of the elders declared, his voice shaking though his words were firm. She has brought too much unrest among us. And with that decree her fate was sealed. They pulled her closer to the edge where the ground softened into mud and reeds. She dug her heels into the earth, trying to root herself, but the strength of many was against the strength of one. Her hands clawed at the air, her nails broke against the arms that restrained her, yet still they dragged her forward. The current grew louder, as though the river itself raised its voice in defiance. Her final cries pierced the night. Why do you hate me for what I cannot change? Why do you cast me away for the love the river gives freely? Her words broke the last remnants of light, but they fell on ears unwilling to listen. Some in the crowd flinched, tears running down their faces, but they did not intervene. Fear bound them tighter than ropes. With a final shove, they threw her into the rushing waters. The splash swallowed her scream, and the river roared as if enraged by their deed. She thrashed, arms flailing, lungs burning with each desperate gasp. The weight of her dress dragged her downward, the current pulling her deeper and deeper into its cold embrace. From the bank, they watched in silence, some with grim satisfaction, others with trembling hands that they dared not unclench. The girl's eyes broke the surface once, wide with terror, begging for a hand to save her. None came. Her fingers reached skyward, but the river tugged her down again, swallowing her pleas. Soon, only ripples marked the place where she had vanished. The villagers waited until even those ripples stilled, until the river seemed calm once more, hiding the violence it had just witnessed. When the silence settled, shame crept among them like a fog. Some whispered prayers under their breath, as though to cleanse their hearts of guilt. Others muttered that it was necessary, that she had to be silenced. Yet in their eyes lingered something unshakable, fear. For deep within them they knew the river did not forget and it did not forgive. They turned away one by one, leaving the bank as though abandoning the scene might erase it from memory. The night swallowed their footsteps, leaving only the restless river behind. The stars reflected faintly on the water, but even their light seemed dimmer, as though they too mourned. And beneath the surface, where light could not reach, the girl's body drifted with the current. But though they believed the river to be her grave, the river had other plans. Bro, this is exactly 900 words. Do you want me to continue with the river's sill? Beneath the surface, where most would find only darkness and silence, she did not sink into death. The cold gripped her chest, her lungs screamed for air, and her limbs grew heavy, yet the river did not let her fall as it would any other body. Instead, it held her, cradling her like a child in the arms of a mother who refused to surrender. The current that should have dragged her deeper slowed, curling around her like ribbons of unseen hands. At first, she thought it was only her mind clinging to illusions in her final moments. She believed she was dreaming as breath abandoned her, that the water's strange embrace was a comfort born of desperation. But then she heard it, whispers moving through the current, a sound both soft and thunderous, speaking words she did not know yet understood in her bones. The river was alive. It was speaking to her. Its voice was not one but many, layered like countless drops converging into a single flow. It murmured of things long hidden, of ancient bargains made before her ancestors walked the earth. It told her that the river had always been a watcher, flowing silently, carrying not just water but memory, grief, rage, and power. And now it had chosen her. The water filled her lungs, yet she did not drown. Instead, it became breath itself, cold and sharp, flooding her veins with something more than life. Her body no longer fought against the current. It yielded, and in yielding she found strength. The weight of her dress, the heaviness of her limbs, all faded. She floated as if the water carried her willingly, no longer against her but with her. Visions came then, shards of memory not her own. She saw faces of women from generations past, their eyes wide with both sorrow and fire. They too had been wronged, cast aside, betrayed by those closest to them. The river had cradled them as it now cradled her, whispering promises of vengeance, of balance restored. She saw battles fought in shadows, curses born from grief, and villages humbled when they dared to think the river only quenched thirst and gave fish. You are ours, the current whispered, weaving its sound through her heartbeat. They gave you to us, but we choose what is kept and what is returned. You will not sink unseen. You will rise. Her chest no longer ached. Her fear dissolved. Where terror once lived, a strange calm settled. Her body glowed faintly beneath the waves, her scars, those same scars that had made her the subject of envy, now pulsed with a silver-blue light. The river's energy threaded into them, turning each mark into a symbol of power. Her wounds were no longer reminders of pain but runes etched into her skin by fate. She reached out her hand, and the water coiled around her fingers like serpents, obedient and alive. It obeyed her as much as she obeyed it. For the first time in her life, she understood that her connection to the river had never been mere affection. It had been a calling, a bond deeper than blood. Above the surface, the villagers had already left, believing the water had swallowed her as planned. None lingered to see the glow that began to ripple beneath the current, the way the reeds swayed though no wind blew, or the faint hum that stirred the still night air. If they had stayed, they would have seen the impossible. The river did not consume her, it guarded her. Time seemed to dissolve as she drifted, neither alive nor dead, but something in between. The river continued its whispers, teaching her, filling her with secrets carried from the mountains to the sea. It spoke of storms yet to come, of justice that would not be denied. Every word sank into her bones, heavy yet freeing, as if she had always carried this destiny within her but had never been ready to awaken it. Her hair floated around her like strands of black silk, her eyes opening to the darkness yet seeing clearly. She could feel every movement within the river, the dart of fish, the shifting of rocks, even the stirring of roots that reached into the water from the shore. She was not separate from it anymore. She was the river, and the river was her. When she finally rose toward the surface, it was not with the panic of a drowning girl but the certainty of one returning from an initiation. The water parted for her gently, rippling in circles as though bowing to her emergence. Her head broke through the surface and she drew in breath, not the ragged gasp of survival, but a calm inhalation, as if she had merely been resting below. The night greeted her with silence. The villagers were gone, their crime committed, their guilt left in the darkness. Only the stars watched, reflected on the river's skin, shimmering like witnesses sworn to secrecy. She stood in the shallows, her wet dress clinging, her scars shining faintly beneath the moonlight. Though alone, she no longer felt forsaken. A strength pulsed within her veins, carrying the rhythm of the river itself. Every drop of water around her seemed aware, waiting, listening. She raised her hands slowly, and the current responded, swirling in patterns around her legs, rising as though eager to obey. She whispered, her voice trembling with both awe and newfound power, "You did not take me. You kept me." The water rippled in answer, a soft lap against her ankles, a promise sealed in silence. The girl who had been cast away was gone. In her place stood something more, anointed by the river, bound to its whispers, charged with its vengeance. The villagers had sought to bury her beneath the current, but instead, they had delivered her to the heart of its power. And soon, they would learn the mistake of believing the river would ever serve their cruelty. For now, the water held her, cradling her once more but differently. Not as a victim. Not as a child. As its chosen. The river, which had always been the lifeblood of the village, began to change. At first, the signs were subtle, easy to dismiss as chance or the temper of nature. The fishermen cast their nets at dawn as they had for generations, but when they pulled them back, they were empty. The water that once teemed with silver-scaled fish now offered only weeds and mud. Day after day, their nets came back barren, until the elders frowned and muttered prayers to forgotten gods. They told themselves it was a passing misfortune, but deep in their bones, unease stirred. The women who drew water for cooking noticed another shift. The river rose and fell without reason. At times it swelled in the night, lapping against the banks as though swollen with storms, though the skies remained clear. At other times it shrank back, shallow and mean, as if denying them its gift. Children who came to play at the shallows whispered that the river no longer laughed with them, no longer sparkled beneath the sun. Its surface seemed to watch, dark and brooding, as though something beneath waited to surface. Then came the reflections. It was a boy who saw it first. Kneeling by the river to splash his face, he froze. Looking back at him was not his own image but hers, the girl they had thrown into the depths. Her face glimmered in the water, pale and still, eyes open but unblinking. He screamed and stumbled backward, falling into the dirt. When others came running, they found nothing unusual. The water showed only their frightened, sweaty faces. Yet the boy swore upon his life that she had been there, staring at him, her lips moving as if to speak words he could not hear. More whispers followed. A woman claimed that as she filled her pot, she saw the girl's reflection beside her own, standing silently with wet hair clinging to her shoulders. A fisherman declared that when he bent over his canoe to push it into the water, she appeared below him, staring upward, her eyes shimmering like moonlit stones. Each person who spoke of it swore the same. She was not gasping, not drowning, but watching. Watching with a calmness more terrifying than rage. The elders called meetings beneath the baobab tree, their voices tight with unease. The river has moods, they said. It rises, it falls, it withholds its gifts. This is nothing new. But their words rang hollow even to their own ears. Never before had the river starved them so thoroughly, never before had it mirrored the face of one they themselves had cast into its depths. Children were warned to stay away, yet they lingered at the edges, drawn by curiosity. Some claimed they heard her laughter in the ripples, though none dared repeat it loudly. Others swore that at night, when the moon glowed and the village was quiet, the river sang, not with the gurgle of water against rocks but with a human voice. A voice too soft to understand, yet too steady to be mistaken. The strangeness grew. Goats tethered near the banks grew restless, pulling at their ropes, bleating as if they sensed danger in the current. Birds avoided perching on the reeds, circling instead as though the water had turned sour. When rains came, the river no longer behaved as it should. It flooded quickly, swallowing fields without warning, then retreated just as suddenly, leaving cracked earth behind. And always, her presence lingered. Those who dared fetch water alone returned pale, clutching their pots too tightly, whispering of eyes in the depths. Some said her reflection no longer waited to be seen. It surfaced whenever the river wished, bending light to show her face even in places where water lay still. Her image began to appear not only in the river but in bowls filled from it, in puddles after a storm, in the sheen of wet stones. The more they tried to deny her, the more she appeared, as though claiming every drop of water as her own mirror. Fear began to seep into daily life. Conversations that once carried laughter now ended in silence whenever someone mentioned the river. Mothers forbade their children from playing near it, fathers hesitated before setting out to fish, and women drew water quickly, eyes fixed downward, hands trembling. At night, fires burned longer than usual, as though the villagers sought comfort from flame, a force they still trusted more than the shifting will of the river. The ones most unsettled were those who had taken part in her betrayal. They walked with heavy steps, their eyes darting constantly to the ground, to the shadows, to the riverbanks. They alone knew that these signs were not the whims of nature but consequences of what they had done. Though they tried to stay silent, their fear betrayed them. Some awoke drenched in sweat, claiming they had dreamed of her rising from the current, her lips dripping water as she whispered their names. Others avoided the river altogether, sending their children or wives in their place, though even they could not escape the sense of being watched. Rumors spread faster than wind. The river refuses fish because it is angry, some said. It is mourning the one we fed it. Others whispered darker thoughts. She is not gone. The river holds her and she is speaking to it. Soon, the whispers grew into fear that silenced even the boldest voices. No one dared laugh near the water anymore. No one dared speak her name aloud. Yet silence did not protect them. The river made itself heard in its own way. It groaned at night, a low rumble that shook the banks. It shimmered with unnatural colors under the sun. And in its mirrored skin, her reflection grew bolder, no longer fleeting but lingering, as if daring them to deny her existence. By the time the first child fell ill after drinking from the river, their fear had ripened into dread. The elders no longer called meetings, they had no answers. The villagers began to realize that this was no passing misfortune, no season of bad luck. The river was no longer theirs to control. It belonged to her. Night fell heavily over the village, thicker than usual, as if the darkness itself had weight. The moon hung swollen in the sky, yet its light seemed weaker, veiled by a strange mist that rolled from the river. The villagers huddled inside their huts, fires burning low, trying to banish the unease that had seeped into their bones since the first signs began. But no fire, no closed door, no whispered prayer could keep what stirred in the night away. It began with dreams. The children who slept first stirred and whimpered, their small bodies trembling beneath thin mats. Their parents leaned over them, brushing sweat from their foreheads, whispering comforts, but the children's eyes darted beneath their lids, trapped in visions they could not escape. They dreamed of the river, wide and endless, and in its center stood the girl, the one they had cast away. She was silent at first, her wet hair clinging to her face, her gaze unblinking. Then her lips moved, and though no sound should have come, her voice filled their heads, soft and relentless, whispering names. Names of those who had bound her arms, who had dragged her screaming to the water's edge, who had turned away when her cries split the night. The children woke crying, insisting she had called to them, insisting she had spoken the names of their mothers, fathers, uncles. Their parents shushed them harshly, warning them never to repeat such things, but their own dreams soon betrayed them. For as the night deepened, the adults too began to see her. In their sleep, the river flowed into their minds, and in the middle of its dark waters she stood, her figure shimmering like light on waves. She did not shout, she did not rage, she only whispered their names, one after another, each syllable a dagger of guilt. Some woke gasping, clutching their chests as if the weight of her voice still pressed upon them. Others remained frozen in their mats, unable to move, the image of her lingering even as their eyes opened. Her face followed them into waking moments, etched behind their lids, her presence refusing to leave. But it was not only in dreams that she returned. Shadows began to stir within the huts. Flames and clay lamps wavered, stretching unnaturally, bending into forms that should not exist. In the corners, in the spaces between breaths, villagers swore they saw her silhouette, dripping, patient, watching. Some claimed they heard the sound of water dripping though their floors were dry. Others said the mats beneath them grew damp as though river water seeped in. By midnight, the village was alive with terror. Men who prided themselves on courage sat awake, spears in hand, yet their eyes darted to every corner, afraid of what they could not strike. Women held their children tightly, rocking them, but their ears strained against the silence, waiting for the voice they feared and expected. And then it came. It began as a murmur outside, a sound like the ripple of water against stone. Then it swelled, growing into words. Her voice, unmistakable, threaded through the night air. It was neither loud nor soft. It was everywhere, seeping into every ear, every mind. "I know you," she whispered. "I remember." She called names, each one carrying weight like a curse. A man who had tied the ropes around her wrists fell to his knees, clutching his head, swearing he heard her breath against his ear. A woman who had urged the others to hurry, to silence her cries, covered her mouth with her hands, sobbing uncontrollably as though she feared her own voice might betray her guilt. Each guilty soul heard their name whispered, and with it came visions. Visions of the river swallowing them whole, visions of their bodies dragged down by invisible hands, their lungs filling with cold water. The brave tried to deny it. One man shouted into the night, "She is dead. She cannot return." But his words faltered when he saw water dripping from the rafters of his hut, though no rain had fallen. The droplets pooled at his feet, and when he looked down, he swore he saw her reflection staring back at him from the water's surface, her lips curving into a knowing smile. He fled screaming, and others followed, running into the night only to hear her voice carried on the wind. The river itself seemed alive. It roared though no storm fed it, its current thrashing as though restless. From the banks, faint lights rose, dancing like pale flames above the water. Those who dared look closer saw her shape among them, her arms outstretched, her hair streaming as if carried by the current. She did not step onto land, yet her presence stretched into the village, filling every hut, every shadow. No one could escape. Even the innocent, those who had not raised their hands against her, felt her presence. But to them it was different. They felt sorrow more than terror, a mourning weight that pressed upon their hearts. They wept for her in silence, ashamed they had done nothing to save her. For them, her voice carried not their names but laments, soft reminders of the cruelty they had allowed to happen. The guilty, however, suffered most. They heard her at every turn, whispering in the rustle of grass, in the creak of wood, in the gurgle of their own throats. They could not drink without tasting river water. They could not close their eyes without seeing her face. Some scratched at their ears until they bled, desperate to rid themselves of the sound. Others stumbled into the night, begging forgiveness, but the river gave no answer except its restless churn. By dawn the village was broken. Sleep had abandoned them, their huts reeked of fear, and whispers of her return spread like wildfire. They no longer dared deny her. She was there, in their dreams, in their shadows, in their very breath. The girl they had cast into the river had not drowned. She had been carried, transformed, and now she had returned with the power of water itself. And the night was only the beginning of her vengeance. The sun rose over the village with an uneasy glow, its warmth doing nothing to ease the fear that had festered overnight. The villagers emerged from their huts with tired eyes, their faces pale with exhaustion from dreams that would not release them. But the river had not finished with them. What began in whispers and visions now prepared to roar with fury, for the girl's spirit no longer lingered in silence. She had found her weapon, and it was the very river they had trusted for generations. The first sign came when the fishermen set out to cast their nets. For years, the river had fed the people faithfully, but that morning the waters churned violently, throwing their small canoes from side to side. Nets tore apart as if shredded by unseen hands, and the men swore they felt something pulling them down. When they hauled their nets back, they found not fish but black silt and tangled weeds. One man leaned too far over in desperation, trying to scoop what little he could, and the current rose like a hand and yanked him into the depths. His cries cut through the morning air, but no one reached him before the river swallowed him whole. His body never surfaced. Panic spread through the village. Some argued that it was only misfortune, that the man had been careless. But those who had heard their names whispered the night before knew better. They gathered in fearful circles, whispering that her vengeance had begun, that the river itself had become her blade. Their fears proved true that very night when the waters rose again. The rains had not fallen, yet the river swelled as though fed by storms unseen. The current pushed against the banks with such force that the ground cracked, swallowing fields and flooding paths. Livestock were swept away in the rush, their cries carrying across the night. The villagers tried to move to higher ground, clutching their children, but the water followed, rising unnaturally fast. Whirlpools formed in places where the river had always been calm. They spun with terrifying speed, dragging in everything that touched their edges. Those who had conspired to cast her into the river suffered worst of all. One by one they found themselves pulled toward the water, no matter how far they tried to flee. A woman who had tied the ropes around the girl's wrists screamed when her hut flooded faster than any other. The water climbed her walls, filling the room in moments, and when she tried to escape, the current dragged her feet from beneath her. Her family watched helplessly as she was swept out into the river, her hands clawing at the air before vanishing beneath the surface. Another man, who had mocked her cries and urged the others to be swift in their cruelty, was seen running from the village in the dead of night. He thought he could escape by leaving the river behind, but the ground softened under his feet, turning to mud that sucked him down. He shouted for help, but no one dared approach, for around him water bubbled up from nowhere, swallowing him whole. When dawn came, only his footprints remained, filled with stagnant pools. The vengeance spread beyond individuals. Fields that once yielded abundant harvests lay drowned beneath muddy water, their crops rotting in the flood. Huts collapsed under the weight of the rising river, whole families displaced and forced to gather on what dry ground remained. Every attempt to rebuild was destroyed by another surge, another sudden rise of the current. The villagers realized that this was no ordinary flood. The river had chosen sides. It carried her spirit, her rage, her justice, and it would not relent until every guilty soul was punished. Some begged forgiveness at the water's edge, kneeling in the mud with hands lifted high. They called her name, pleading for mercy, but the river only churned louder, its foam glistening like teeth. One elder, who had spoken against her in council, waded into the water to prove his courage, shouting that the dead should stay dead. The river answered with a whirlpool that spun beneath his feet. He had no time to turn before he was dragged down. The crowd screamed as the water closed over his head, leaving only bubbles rising where he had stood. The terror grew unbearable. No one could sleep, for the sound of rushing water filled their ears, even far from the banks. Mothers clutched their children, fearful that the river might claim them too. And yet the innocent were spared. Though the waters rose around every hut, those who had not joined in her betrayal found strange pockets of safety. Their homes stood firm when others fell, their fires remained burning when others drowned. They too were afraid, but they recognized the pattern. The river hunted only those whose hands or voices had condemned the girl. By the third night, the village was unrecognizable. Paths were gone, replaced by muddy streams. Canoes drifted aimlessly where homes once stood. The air smelled of wet decay, of fields rotting under endless water. Survivors huddled on patches of high ground, watching the current for signs of the next attack. They did not speak her name aloud, for fear it would draw her nearer, but her presence was everywhere. In the rippling water they saw her eyes. In the roar of the current they heard her cries. Her vengeance was patient, relentless. She did not strike all at once but one by one, ensuring each guilty soul felt the weight of their crime before the water claimed them. Every drowning was a reminder, every whirlpool a symbol, every flood a judgment. The villagers whispered that she was no longer simply a girl. They said the river itself had adopted her, made her its daughter, and together they had become a force no mortal hand could withstand. As the days passed, the survivors began to understand that this was not simply punishment. It was a lesson. The river had shown them mercy only for the innocent. It had shown no forgiveness to those who betrayed her. And so they lived in trembling silence, waiting to see whose name the river would call next, knowing that her vengeance was not yet complete. The survivors of her vengeance lived with fear carved into their bones, the kind of fear that never left even when the sun was high, when children laughed, when the air was thick with the smell of roasted yams and spiced stew. Their fear was not of shadows or beasts or storms, it was of the river, the same river that had once been their lifeline. It was the place where they had bathed their children, fetched their water, and cast their nets for fish. But now it was a graveyard, a restless spirit's domain, a living reminder of what they had done. No one spoke of her openly, yet her presence was everywhere. When women carried pots to the edge, their hands shook so badly that the clay slipped, breaking into shards before touching the water. When fishermen approached with nets, their eyes darted to the surface as though expecting her face to rise, her scarred, dripping hands reaching out to pull them under. Some swore they heard her laugh ripple through the waves at night, a sound half song, half moan, as though mocking them for their cowardice. Others claimed her voice called their names in the dead of night, dragging them from sleep into cold sweats. One man stumbled into the darkness after hearing her whisper, swearing she had called him from beyond, only to vanish by the riverbank. The next morning they found his footprints leading straight into the water, and nothing else. His family burned incense for days, but the smoke only thickened and curled back toward the river as though claimed. Those who had plotted her end avoided the waters most of all. They dared not wash their faces in it, nor taste its cold touch on their lips. They sent children or strangers to fetch water, bribing them with food or coins, while they themselves stayed far, far away. But even when they stayed in the safety of their huts, the river came to them in other ways. Pots filled with water began to grow murky overnight, filled with silt as if the river itself had crept inside. Bowls of palm wine turned bitter without reason. At feasts, gourds of water spilled themselves across the earth without a hand to tip them, spreading wet stains that twisted into the shape of her name. In the marketplace, elders shook their heads and muttered that such things were the work of vengeance unfulfilled. She was not meant to be cast away, one whispered, staring at the trembling villagers. When the river takes, it keeps. But when the river gives back, it does not forgive. Yet no one dared to confront it directly. Instead, they spoke in hushed tones, hiding behind riddles, afraid that her spirit might be listening, that speaking her name too boldly might summon her face out of the waters once again. Children, innocent and unaware, still played too close to the bank sometimes, and when they did, mothers screamed in panic, dragging them away as if death itself lurked beneath the surface. Some claimed to see her form beneath the ripples, watching with eyes that never blinked, waiting for another life to claim. At night, dogs barked toward the river, their howls echoing against the village huts until silence pressed heavily over all. No one wanted to admit it aloud, but deep in their bones they knew she was still there, present in every wave, every current, every rising flood. The village festivals, once filled with dancing near the water, were abandoned or pushed far inland. Drums still beat, but no one dared let the sound echo too close to her resting place. The river was no longer their companion, their provider. It was an enemy, one they could not fight with spears or charms. Even the medicine men grew pale when asked for protection, muttering that water spirits answered to no man. Some secretly left offerings by the riverbank, calabashes of oil, carved figurines, even strands of hair, hoping to appease her, to soften her wrath. But each morning the offerings were gone, and still the river hissed louder at night, as though mocking their attempts. Whispers spread that those who had betrayed her still felt her hand on their shoulders, cold and wet, pressing down when they least expected it. They woke gasping, drenched in sweat, with the taste of river water in their mouths. One woman screamed in her sleep for nights on end, claiming she saw the drowned girl's eyes staring through her hut walls. Another man, once bold enough to boast of what they had done, began to wander the village muttering to himself, begging forgiveness from shadows no one else could see. Within weeks, his body was found at the banks, twisted, his eyes open wide as though he had looked upon her face in the last moment. The survivors knew the truth. Her spirit was not gone, nor was her justice complete. She had become the river, and the river had become her. There was no escaping it, no forgetting it, no undoing it. Each ripple carried her name, each current her rage. They avoided the river at all costs, but still it found them, slipping into their homes, their food, their dreams. And so, in silence and trembling, they lived under her watchful gaze, whispering in fear to their children, "Do not anger the waters. Do not mock the drowned. For she is there, waiting still, and her voice rides every wave." Generations passed, yet the story of the river child did not fade. It became a warning carried from tongue to tongue, from elders to grandchildren, woven into lullabies, carved into proverbs, and whispered around fires when the night grew too heavy with silence. The river was no longer spoken of simply as water but as a living witness, a keeper of memory, a place where innocence, once betrayed, could return sharpened into vengeance. Parents told their children, "Do not mock kindness, do not wound those who have done no wrong, for the river never forgets." The tale lived in the rhythm of their lives, like the beating of a drum that never stopped. The young no longer approached the waters carelessly. When they fetched water, they bowed their heads, dropping coins or flowers as quiet offerings, acknowledging the spirit they believed still lingered beneath the surface. The girls especially were warned to stay cautious of envy. "A kind heart draws both love and jealousy," the elders told them, "but the river sees what men hide. And if cruelty rises, so will the waters." These words etched themselves deep into the minds of every child, shaping the way they treated one another. To strike the innocent was not only shameful, it was dangerous, for the river would surely rise again to defend them. Every rainy season, when the waters swelled, people remembered. The floods were not explained only by nature but by her spirit, reminding them she had not truly left. If a man was swept away in a sudden current, whispers filled the village, perhaps his heart was not clean. If fish refused the nets, elders shook their heads knowingly, the river remembers and the river refuses. Nothing was seen as ordinary anymore, for the story had bled into every ripple, every silence, every mist rising off the surface at dawn. Festivals changed too. Where once people sang and danced carelessly by the banks, now they held ceremonies of reverence. They placed calabashes filled with food, beads and palm oil on floating leaves, sending them gently downriver, asking the waters to stay calm, to forgive, to bless rather than curse. Drums pounded slowly, their rhythm echoing like a heartbeat, while chants reminded the people of the girl who had once been cast aside and returned not as a victim, but as vengeance itself. Children, wide-eyed, clutched their mothers as the story was retold year after year. The betrayal, the drowning, the return. With each telling, the fear and reverence only deepened. No one dared question whether the tale was true. It was no longer just a story, it was a law of nature, woven into the soul of the village. To betray innocence was to awaken wrath. To harm the pure was to summon doom. The river had become judge, jury, and executioner, and no man or woman could escape its reach once guilt was upon them. In times of conflict, elders invoked her name to settle disputes. Think carefully, they warned quarreling kin, for if your heart is unjust, the river may choose you next. Arguments often ended in silence, the memory of her vengeance too powerful to ignore. Even travelers from faraway lands heard the tale. Merchants carried it across valleys and mountains, telling of the cursed river where innocence turned to power. Some came in awe, others in fear, but all left with the same truth pressed upon them. Rivers were not just water. They were memory, spirit, and retribution. The girl's name was rarely spoken, out of reverence or fear, but her story traveled without needing it. She was no longer one person but a symbol, an eternal warning. As generations folded into one another, the story took root as legend. Grandmothers recited it under the moonlight, their voices slow and heavy, while children listened with held breath. Men taught their sons that cruelty would not bring strength but downfall, and women reminded their daughters that resilience carried unseen power. The river, once a simple flow of life, had become a mirror reflecting human actions back upon them. To stand at its edge was to see not only water but judgment. Even in times of peace, when the river ran calm and generous, no one forgot. The stillness itself felt like her gaze, patient and unblinking. The people knew that silence did not mean absence. They had learned that the river carried not only fish and water but memory, and memory never died. The girl's suffering had not been buried in the waves, it had been sharpened into something eternal. And so the tale lived on, a reminder that cruelty leaves scars not only on the body but upon the world, scars that may rise again when least expected. And so, as night fires flickered and the elders' voices wove through the dark, the children leaned closer, hearing the words they would one day pass down themselves. They threw her into the river, thinking her life was over. But the river brought her back, and with her came vengeance. Never betray innocence, for the waters remember. Never cast the pure into the depths, for they may rise again, and when they do, they will not return alone.